of the people who actually were taken across the Atlantic. As far as I can see, all of this was involuntary. British officials made a decision, often before the recaptives stepped off the slave vessel, and there's little difference, at first sight at least, between the British procedures and the French practice between 48 and 61, 1848 and 61, of actually buying slaves on the African coast and then declaring them free, but forcing them onto a vessel and selling them as contract laborers in both Réunion and the French Caribbean. And it's worth noting that children were a large component of this movement too. According to the data we've got, over 1/3 of the people who moved were under the age of 15. So what I'm pointing to here on the part of at least the British, was a kind of a revival of the kind of slave trade, albeit not one with permanent servitude attached to it, but rather with a term. Sometimes as low as 1 year, sometimes as much as 5 years, but in all cases, the actual migrant, him or herself, did not have any input on the decision. So, to go back to the tables, of the 181,000 recaptives here, it would seem that the majority actually stayed on the African side of the continent, and those forcibly relocated in this last phase total perhaps 15,000. But even after allowing for that, you still have the majority of liberated Africans remaining on the African continent, albeit thousands of miles from their homelands. It's thus a very mixed bag. Liberation clearly did not mean what we see as liberation meaning today. But in the end, it's also clear that liberated Africans on the old world side of the Atlantic had considerable input over what happened to them thereafter. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
We're awake.
All right. I'll try to be brief. David has basically set the context in which this project developed, and of course its significance. And I just wish he had gone on so that I will have less to say, but I will be brief. Okay. Let me begin by thanking Alex. Alex is such a self-effacing guy, so generous, and he has done so much work on this conference. To get this conference going, I was just telling him how he never looked stressed. For somebody organizing a conference, writing a book, doing all these things, and you will never see it in his face. And he mentioned my name, as if I was one of the organizers of the conference. I'm more than it. It's just his generosity. At best, what I've provided is moral support. Yes, I want to make it clear. I appreciate that though. Okay. The project we're talking about now has really a long history. It's been going on for a long time. And when it began to take a form, the form of a separate database, not when it began, because, you know, I will trace the origins to, you know, David's encounter with some documents going back to the early 70s, when I was still starting elementary school. So I can never claim to be, you know, too much for this on this project. And in 1997, by which time David had written a book using these documents, written many articles, sometimes with Stanley Engelman, and I was a graduate student, almost, you know, getting to the close of my dissertation. Maybe not so close. And I had been using this, you know, articles and books that they were writing, very stimulating, and the way they use quantitative data, you know, with myself I was engaging with that time. And I was wishing I could one day meet David Eltis. Okay, I registered at the University of Toronto. And then in 1997, the summer of 1997, Paul Lovejoy at York University, who was actually also, who was involved with my training from the beginning to the end, coursework, qualifying exam, dissertation, and he organized a summer institute. And it was at that summer institute that I met David Eltis. So when I said, "Are you David Eltis?" You know, I was happy, you could imagine. And I came with, you know, some of those articles and where much stuff in it, things that, you know, I needed clarification and, you know, numbers and some conclusions. And it was asking him questions on those, and we were looking at them, and at a point, he said, "Would you like to work with me?" Of course, I didn't hesitate. He said, okay, he will show me some data. And so at the end of the summer institute, and that was a Saturday morning, very early Saturday morning, he came to my apartment and picked me up. And then we drove to the University of Waterloo, you know, which was maybe an hour from Toronto. And we began to look at the microfilms from Foreign Office papers, FO84. And these were cheap ledgers consisting of these names that this project is about, written in longhand. And we're looking at it, trying to make sense of what we remember. That these names were written long before, well, maybe not too long before, but, you know, before the African languages, African languages that those individuals speak, and in which these names represented, had not yet had orthographies. So you cannot just read it from the convention of somebody who knows the language. So from the very beginning, it was bound to be a massive collaborative effort. And as we were looking at it, and at a point I said, since this name we're reading in Sierra Leone by English-speaking people, you say it. You just say how it sounds to you, so that I'll be listening, not just looking, because that means you can't really. So he would pronounce it and pronounce it. And I'll try to make an interpretation. Basically, that was the basic methodology. That was the basis for everything that began to happen from that time. And his background, of course, is an Englishman who naturalized Canadian. I don't know if now he naturalized American too. And I'm an Igbo Nigerian who had the good fortune of having lived and understands a number of cultures in southern Nigeria and the Middle Belt. And due to schooling, domicile, and all that. And this became handy too, because we're talking about, these numbers names involving people from a lot of things. And of course, we had our job cut out for us. And then what happened too is that one of the elements we introduced in that was that because of this, somebody, a native speaker, try to pronounce the name, what it seems to them, and then somebody, a native speaker too, try to listen. So we engaged to, somebody who, from Cuba, to look at the names from Havana, right? That is Oscar right here. And Oscar, put these names in a tape record, right? And if there were also problems, sometimes the pronunciations are not clear, and then we began the normalization process using technicians to try to improve and enhance the tape, the quality of the tape in order to, because you need to get this thing very clearly, because a little difference can lead to misinterpretation. But it's not even, of course, this is not even foolproof, in spite of everything that I've done, and even how the project has evolved over the years. So, that problem, as I said, originates from the fact that these languages, and people who were writing them were not writing them based on those orthographies. And what then happened is that in putting these names, trying to interpret these names, a number of issues emerged. And of course, you have to engage the question of ethnicity. Ethnic groups are not static. They change over time. They are not created by God. They're not created by God. Ethnic groups are formed, new identities are formed, and so on and so forth. And already, within African studies, there had been some skepticism around ethnicity. In fact, I would even say that those who had written, almost all those who had written about it, Leroy Bell, who was a historian, edited a book about this in Southern Africa, and a lot of all those people were all speaking the same way. And anthropologists, believe that, basically, those who have written about it were saying that ethnic groups did not exist in Africa. For real. That they were constructions by Europeans, or constructions during the colonial era. I'm not making it up. Those groups are still there. And one thing is true. It's true. Some ethnic groups have emerged, and not ethnic group is the same way as it was in the 19th or the 18th century. ethnic groups say, but what we found difficult to accept is that ethnic groups did not exist because there is evidence to the contrary. Okay, but again, there is also a lot of evidence that some ethnic groups emerged during the colonial period, sometimes during some identities during the slave trade era. So you see, it was originally an argument between those who think that all the ethnic groups were there, and those who think none of them were there. But what you have here is both of them, the first group assuming that ethnic groups are static, and the second group somehow believing that ethnic groups are somehow magically erupted, all of them, during the colonial era, but none of which is true. But of course, as I said, some ethnic group did emerge during the colonial era. Anyway, and we got that, and some of the issues that, one of these things is that we used Germany, as an example, for example. There was no Germany. There was no Germany before 1870. Yes. What do you have? Bavaria, Brandenburg, and so many others. But nobody will now doubt that people from those regions that came to America are Germans, for example. We refer to them as Germans, and nobody finds it problematic. So anyway, that is another thing too that comes into this interpretation, because even when some of these people may not have regarded themselves to have come from particular ethnic groups, but at least for heuristic purposes, because they spoke those languages, they identified with a group of people, we can now regard them as Igbo or Yoruba or so and so, right? And so at least, for this. So anyway, that's what we're doing. And in looking at the data themselves, of course, problem erupted, and I will only give you a few examples. One of the things I know is that short names, especially monosyllabic names with one syllable, are the most dangerous names to interpret. Yes. Yes, but somebody, intuitively, someone will say that is that. They're the most difficult. Because you find them, you find many groups, many names like that from different people. So how do you determine this is where this person comes from? Because when the name is long, when there are many syllables, and then you begin to find variations, right? And without those syllables, the variation, there is no variation. So, and that's how we began to develop the categories. So when these names are, okay, this is multi-ethnic, we create a variable. And we create another, a case for that, right? This is multi-ethnic. And what about Muslim? And Muslim, hey, Muslim, you can't use it to determine somebody's ethnicity, necessarily. So we created one Muslim. And that is now, how do you then determine where that particular Muslim comes from? Luckily, we also found that in some names, in the case of some names, some Muslim names, if you can get a clue of the ethnicity of the person. But again, this is a relatively few names, but it helps. Because this is incremental. We try, for example, the name Bashir, which is the way people from northern Nigeria will generally have it. Bashir, B-A-S-H-I-R. But the Yoruba of southwestern Nigeria, that's the Muslim, they call it, they use Bashiru. And of course, the person who is writing it doesn't know any of this, and he just writes what he hears and represent that. So some of these were some of the things that he will give us clues on some of these things. And well, as you will see, some of these things are elaborated in the two papers we published in the early 2000s. One in the history of Africa, which dealt with methodological problems. And then the other one, the Journal of African History, we dealt with a particular group from Cameroon, who were taken to Havana, Cuba. Okay, and since that time, the project has been developing. There have been conferences, and there have been new people, a lot of them doing fantastic work. Have done whole dissertations, and now turning them into books. Many articles. They're coming from various, and these people too have brought in new things, new improvements on the day. First of all, even the numbers. These numbers, you guys, from, Alex and the people from Brazil found new numbers. Even this Phil Misavich from Sierra Leone, the number has increased. And they say, this is just how this thing has evolved. And in 2008, I organized a conference, not on the database in particular, but to look at all those people and their experiences in the various parts of the world. And many people in this room, a number of people in this room were there. Ned Abbas was there. Roseanne was there. By the way, Roseanne, when we started this project, we found that Roseanne had written a PhD dissertation on that. At Princeton, right?
University of Pennsylvania.
Oh, sorry, at Penn. Yes, and stuff. And of course, David was at that conference. And in March this year too, there was a conference on Wayne David. Of course, this project was part of it, but also, of course, his entire work. Because this project database, it took this form because David was already involved in the creation of what I would call master database, right? The transatlantic slave trade database. So, and that provided us a platform, really, because that's where the names of the ships were, that's where the origin and destination and other information was, basically. And we were only, and that's where, we're just trying to use these names to digitize those names. And of course, some of the other improvements that have come since then, when so many other people have been involved, include the use of geographic information systems, right? And a new database, now online, and crowdsourcing. Now people can go into that website and actually make inputs, help you interpret those names, and so on and so forth. So that is the way that I promised you I wasn't going to waste time, and that's where I am. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugo. Questions from the audience?
There's not a question, but a comment. I was glad to see in the data that David had up there that you had, because this is different from the original slave trade database, that you actually had areas receiving liberated Africans